journey, growing freely, no ceiling, no roof. Going deep with no stones to entangle my roots like they do.
Waking up tired and waiting for the horizon to appear. Remind me this work is all for love again. Looking ahead, I see hope in the sky. Give me access and I won't be denied. I won't let go, just hold tight to my hand. The world that we knew would return here. Living my dream without no fear.
Sure that will wipe away all tears.
I hate that my hands can't touch you. My arms and soul hold you, the memories and dreams. Know in my heart that I won't let go. Little me, every day, hard to be, unafraid. Everything is not the same no more. Policies stay the same. They should be ashamed. They should try to hide their face. There is a light that I'm chasing in life. It won't be put out. Thankful I'm alive. Ready or not, I will rise to a brighter day. A world without walls that divide us. I'm grateful for all of that made us.
The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we all call home, Connecticut. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the native people whose land you are on and the history of the place you are in.
The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities and other groups who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. We support all movements working to decenter white voices and dismantle white supremacy. We are actively seeking to dismantle systemic racism, and we raise our voices with those in our community who are already engaged in this vital work. We commit to working alongside you to create transformative change in New Haven and in our global community.
Thank you for joining us for Festival 2021, the Year of Imagine. This year, our programming explores the world, both as it is today and how it can be in the future. This evening, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Reimagining Economies, Entrepreneurship and Building a Solidarity Economy, presented in partnership with Collab New Haven. This event is part of the festival's 26th annual Idea Series, made possible by the generous support from Connecticut Humanities, Connecticut Public, and viewers like you. I'm Fahad Mahidi, a senior advisor to and an alumnus of the Community Leadership Program here in New Haven. What we lived and witnessed over the last 15 months in this state, in this country, and globally is unparalleled. And as we begin to emerge and make sense of what we're living through, we're left with big, powerful, and courageous questions. Among those questions undoubtedly will be, how do we meaningfully participate in economic, political, and social systems that mirror our deeply held values? This evening's conversation and discussion, I'm sure will provide compelling testimony to what's possible. I'm delighted to introduce you to my friend, co-founder of Collab New Haven, and our host for this evening, Margaret Lee. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Fahad. So great to see you, and means so much to have you frame this conversation with us. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who is joining us in the audience. My name is Margaret Lee, and I am one of the co-directors of Collab, a local organization here in New Haven that works with Black, Latinx, and women entrepreneurs to build businesses, organizations, and projects to build power for themselves and our communities. And today we're going to be joined by 5 incredible folks who are all doing really inspiring work around reimagining economies. And my hope for today is that each of the panelists can really show up as themselves, engage with one another, and make this hour 15, a true special gift for our community. And we're going to ask a lot of questions today about what a solidarity economy could look like in our communities. Can we create an economic system based on community needs and cooperation, align with social, economic, and environmental justice? Can we reimagine how we define value, how we care for one another and the land, and what might that look like? So now I'd love to invite all of the panelists, Nia, Paul, Esteban, Luis, and Sierra, to the virtual stage. Welcome, 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 everybody. Hello, hello. So good to see you all. I'm grateful to each of you for being a part of this conversation. And I wanted to start today by getting to know you, and importantly, centering why each of you are here today at this panel and also in this work, in the solidarity economy work. So as a way of introduction, I'd love for each of you to say your name and the work and movements you're a part of, and answer this question for us. What brings you here today to this conversation? Why did you say yes? Why does this conversation matter to you? Starting with Nia.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Festival of Ideas. I'm Nia Evans. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of Boston Ujima Project. What brings me here is I definitely was compelled by the description of the panel today. So I can't remember the name offhand. I see in my screen that it's Reimagining Economies. There's a colon, there's a bunch of stuff after that. I can't see what it says. But what I do recall from the description was a merging of economy and culture. And that is what Ujima does, in short. And I think we'll talk about that a little later, but just really appreciated, I think, seeing a reflection of our work in another space. And so definitely was excited to join and talk with others who think about the way we move as Ujima does.
Thank you, Nia. Paul?
Hey, I'm Paul Bryant Hudson, he, them pronouns. I am the untitled creative at The Kitchen, which is a BIPOC-centered co-creating, co-working space here in New Haven. So what brings me here, I guess, is just it's an extension of conversations we've been having here locally, just between friends and colleagues, really sort of shifting the way we interact with the idea of solidarity economies and economic justice from a place of like traditional solution to dreaming and envisioning. So that's kind of the energy I'm bringing here today. I'm excited to dream things up with y'all and envision new possibilities.
Thank you, Paul. Esteban?
Yeah, I want to echo the appreciation that my colleagues just shared for the invitation to be part of this conversation and for all the labor that went into organizing this. I think that start answering the question, this is this work around building a social solidarity economy it's like what I've been living and breathing for over 25 years now. And so it was an easy yes for me. And I recognize how important it is for there to be more spaces, more organizing in this field, in this world. In some ways, even just to balance out all the energy that we put in movements toward resistance and defending, holding the line, and just defending very bare minimum things, and how much effort still needs to go into building the new things that are regenerative and sustainable, and that are rooted in a liberated world and a liberated future, rather than constrained by the idea of injustices and just fighting against that. So that's part of why I said yes. My name is Esteban. I use he and him pronouns. I'm based in Philadelphia, Lenape territory. I'm originally from New York, which is also Lenape land, and I play a couple roles in this field, given that most of my life has and organizing have connected in some way to social solidarity, economy organizing. So one of those is that I'm the executive director for the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. We're the only national grassroots membership-based organization for worker-owned cooperative businesses in this country. I'm also a board member for CCOPA, which is the international association for all of the other federations around the world, and that idea of solidarity and mutualism, I think, is something that we'll talk about even more later. But those are some of the hats I wear. I'm also a worker owner and a founder of a co-op called Aorta, and we do political education and training, facilitation, and capacity building for movement-based organizations. So Aorta is actually an acronym. It stands for Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. And we are 11 years old this month. So that is something that I continue to do part-time as a worker owner. Maybe I'll leave my introduction at that. I'm just excited to dig into the conversation in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. Sierra?
Yeah, thank you all so much for having us. I'd just like to say first, I guess, my name. So my name is Sierra Peters, she, they pronouns. I'm an artist, writer, and communications director at Boston Dreamer Project, currently living between Boston and Brooklyn. As Esteban said, unceded Lenape territory. So that's where I am. I think, yeah, why do I come to this conversation? I think first, like very functionally at UGMA, we try not to have just one person come to any kind of speaking engagement or to represent UGMA, because we truly want to embody the spirit of like cooperativism and like resisting sole authorship. So the function of that is that Nia and I end up on a lot of panels together. But I think the thing that interested me the most is everything that everybody else said. Particularly Esteban, I think that you mentioned, and Nia actually mentioned, like this mirroring or collapsing of economy as well as arts. That's something that I think about a lot as I like move through many spaces as an artist and writer, both organizing spaces, a lot of holding space, as well as like, you know, just doing things on my own. And they don't necessarily call themselves solidarity economy spaces, but they move with those ethics. And so I was just super interested and drawn in by, as Nia said, the description. So thank you all for having us, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Sierra. Luis?
Hi, all. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and to be part of this conversation. I'll start by about 20 years ago. I was a young boy, immigrant kid from a multi-status undocumented family. And I would come and volunteer at the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. And I would take the bus and I would just kind of hang out for my dad lived in New Haven. So for me, when I was asked to be part of this, I was like, of course, this is really, really exciting for me. And I think how I grew up and my family has really informed how I navigate and really looking into, how do we create a space for undocumented folks to thrive and to create a space to really make sure that the incredible resilience and intelligence and resourcefulness of our communities, that we give that a shot. And I think I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, so currently I'm also the organizer for the Connecticut Working Families Party and one of the founders of the Semilla Collective here in New Haven. And I am actually right now I'm in Puerto Rico. And really excited to be here.
Thank you all so much for those introductions. It's such an honor to be in the same room with you all and having this conversation. And, you know, I'd like to dive in by kind of naming the problem. You know, we have a diverse audience here with us. Love to hear from you all about what about the current economic system is not working for our communities. What is the need? And is diversity, equity, and inclusion in our current economic system enough? And I'd love to start with you, Nia, if you feel up for it, on that question, and hear from anyone else who'd like to chime in as well.
Sure. Oh boy. So what is the problem? What is the need in our current economic system? And is DEE enough in our current economic system? So quick short answer, no, to is DEI enough in our current economic system? But let me just kind of circle back to the beginning of that question in terms of what is the problem and what is the need in our current economic system. So what I would identify as a problem that I think about a lot, I think, is our understanding of how power is derived. And I think the way that it's related to our economic system, which is capitalism, is that power is understood as a zero-sum proposition. So in order for me to win, somebody's got to lose. I also kind of have, I will also debate as to that actually is accurate, or if we've just learned that so long within a capitalist system that we equate the two, and maybe it is a bit of a mistake to equate the two. But it's definitely yeah, it's definitely a very I think strong belief that we hold. And so I think our understanding of power is pretty perverse. And it is based on the denigration of people and communities. So that's the problem. That's a problem that I think about a lot, which is how can we conceive of power differently? And so then I think a need that I think about a lot with respect to Ujima's work that I think is related is I would say a need for real voice and say from all communities. And I'm reflecting on a workshop that we did in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where there was an elder in the community who said, we hear about voice a lot. And so there's this idea of kind of input, this idea of engagement. But there's a big difference between voice and say. And say is real decision-making power. And that stuck with me. And so I think that is something I think about as a need, is for our communities to be able to see the direct link between our needs, our decisions, and then what collective decisions are. And right now there is no direct link. So I feel like, having said that, if you agree with me, I think DEI comes nowhere near what I've just talked about, at least DEI in its current iteration in our economic system. But I'll stop there to allow room for other voices.
Any other comments from anyone else? Thank you, Nia.
Are we just jumping in, or are we going around it?
Go for it, please.
So I'm ready. I'm always ready to have this conversation. I think when we're talking about what the problem is and what the need is, we need to be much more comfortable naming capitalism and racial capitalism. I think that that's starting to happen, which is in some ways a relief. I say in some ways because then, anytime we actually break through, then the language or the framework to get co-opted. Hence your comment about DEI, which, for example, is an acronym that stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's often missing a power analysis and therefore missing the point of what it is that we're trying to do. So I think putting that right in the center and being courageous about articulating like what the problem is. I saw that there was a question, for example, in the chat about like, oh, well, what if we do like a friendlier version of capitalism? Like, does this exist? Is there a way for capitalism to exist without being extractive? And I think that I have been thinking a lot about the ways that being born in this country, my family is not from this country, but I was born here, and all of the propaganda and in some ways like pretty willful gaslighting being a Black American of that we're subject to in the US, especially when there is this like firewall around this country where those many Americans who don't have connections overseas, family, or aren't tied to diaspora outside of the sort of media market and the framework or even the education system in the US, certainly the political system, discursively or otherwise, it's hard to get a grasp of like what's really going on. And what's really going on is that capitalism is a globally encompassing dominant economic system that is historically entrenched, and it literally means the extraction, expropriation, dispossession, and exploitation of people, of land, of indigenous, like you name it. That's what it is. And so any boosterism to try to like rescue or save capitalism is in and of itself an admission that capitalism is the problem. There is no way to sort of whitewash it and be like, well, what if we do a different version? I think to the comment in the chat, it does become not capitalism. It does become maybe post-capitalism or something else that we're moving toward. And so I think part of the work that we have to do, not just in the US, but in many of the imperialist countries that have hundreds of years of history of whitewashing and propagandizing capitalism as this sort of liberatory system for everyone, and making us sort of invested in our own exploitation. Some of the work that we have to do is freeing ourselves of the idea of needing to rescue it. It's a little bit like intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Like there is a thing where we have been captive and we've been raised within this this family, within this community, where that describes itself as capitalist, where we've been told that like that's what is in our best interest, and that the U.S.'s role and some of the Western capitalist economies that our role has been one of liberation and saving people with this system. That actually is a problem, and it takes a certain amount of work to recognize that we are the villain, that system is the villain, that we are both the villain and the victim, right? And so I think when we get into the discussion about what does it mean to sort of reimagine this stuff and what is the role of art in sort of breaking that open and taking it seriously, it means dealing with that. The term for that is Marxism. That Marxism literally is just a critique of capitalism. And so any move towards saying, oh, this system is kind of messed up. Like, why is wealth inequality so extreme? Why is it racialized? Why is it global? Why is it, woven through imperialism? Those are all motivating, I think, factors for entering into this conversation and then beginning to build this new world.
Thank you, Esteban. I'd love to create some room for Paul or Luis, especially from sort of the local perspective. What have you seen here in New Haven through your work and your life here in relation to this question?
Sure, I can start. Thank you, Esteban and Nia, for that. I think that looking at this through a political sense, I really enjoyed the beginning of this presentation when we named the original peoples who inhabited this land, and then if we look into New Haven, for instance. New Haven has been or is a space of very wealthy institutions. One of them is Yale University and the Yale New Haven Hospital. But so when we look into how there has been this accumulation of wealth by white people, and how we look at this beautiful the coast of Connecticut, and it's extreme. The wealth inequality is just absurd. And when you go into these communities, there's no brown or black people really that are owners that own these homes. So really comes to play about how New Haven has for many centuries been built on the backs of immigrants, on the backs of black and brown people. So sort of with that in mind, I think with the Semilla Collective, there is people who live in New Haven who don't have the opportunities to thrive and make it. And I think that when we reimagine on how do we create local economies that can thrive, we also have to look at how do we make the political system within the city a space for us to actually make it. Like, how do we create resources for folks to access? How do we create the spaces to have these conversations? And create the ground, for brilliant entrepreneurs that want to start something. And often we don't know where to start because everything has been sort of built not for us.
Yeah, we're so confronted by these realities, and I felt that one part of the work of building towards a solidarity economy and building that movement is really addressing that capitalist mindset, that there's that resistance to alternatives, right? There's so much skepticism that anything else is possible, especially against something so all-encompassing. I fall into that trap a lot. And it's something that we consistently see in the prison abolition movement. And so I wanted to get your thoughts, maybe Esteban, starting with you, like, what is the role of imagination in this work, in your work? And how can we raise consciousness? And what has that looked like for you?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one, part of what I was saying about the kind of propaganda and the Stockholm syndrome of those of us living embedded in capitalist systems is that the framing of it is that not only are alternatives or other things not possible, but also that they're not happening. Like that is the violence, the rhetorical violence is erasing all of the ways in which mutualism, solidarity, mutual aid, gift economies, like all of this is already happening. And they want us to walk around with these ideas in our head that the only thing that's going on is stock trading in Wall Street, or initial public offerings, or whatever it is that the corporatists are doing, lobbying in Washington D.C. to basically entrench the oligarchy and the will of the billionaire class and the 1%. It's like, this is happening every day, right? I have a garden, I'm growing vegetables, I give it away to my neighbors for free. It's not, and I don't walk around with like a chip on my shoulder about it. It's just like what we do in the world. And so I think the first move is even just reframing and recognizing, reclaiming what we're already doing. We have so many elements of post-capitalism. Not ceding the territory or the idea that capitalism is totalizing and has already enveloped every aspects of our lives, because it hasn't. And if you look at the spaces of intimacy, of pleasure, of joy, and connection and care, most of those things are completely outside of a capitalist framework. In fact, that's why they try so hard to sell it to us, whether that's Hallmark holidays or Valentine's Day or rom-coms or whatever it is. They're constantly trying to commodify and monetize these things because they understand that it hasn't actually penetrated into the sort of human to human, the social relationships that bind us together. What was your question again?
No, you answered it. I had a quick follow-up, which is just for folks listening, if you wanted to say a little bit about what you mean by gift economies.
Yeah, but that might actually be better. I wonder if you guys from Virginia want to answer that one.
I knew you were going to say that, Esteban, but go ahead. Or do you want to take it, Sierra? Gift economy?
Yeah, I mean, you got it.
Go ahead, Esteban. You got it.
I think it's just a way of, I think more people are probably familiar with the idea, even like mainstream economists talk about the informal economy, right? Black market and informal jobs and trash pickers and whatever. So the gift economy is like a bougier version of that. It's like also informal, where people do favors for each other. People will, that the gifts might be services, they might be actual goods, but it's not monetized. It's not marked by an exchange that has, money intervening in the exchange of things. So it could include anything from bartering to literally the things that people just like leave on my stoop because I happen to live in a weird, urban environment where people just walk by and they're like, oh yeah, that's Esteban's house. I'm just going to put this little tincture here. Or I'm going to, I found something in the trash that I think his kids would enjoy playing with. And it's like, I'm just going to leave it here on the porch. So all of that, I think, would be a way of understanding the gift economy.
Thank you. And the next question I'd love to pose to both Nia and Sierra, but maybe starting with Paul. And, for me in getting to know this work and being a student of it, one thing that's felt really important to me is to not only look forward and reimagine, but also look back and remember. I'm thinking about all the cooperative thinking. I mean, Esteban, you're kind of bringing this up too, just like it's happening now, it's been happening, right? I'm talking about, indigenous cultures and nations, the Black liberation movement in the US, right? Like this has been here. And I just wanted to ask what role remembrance plays in your work and what histories and what historical practices you draw wisdom from just in your daily life and in your work, starting with Paul.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll just speak to the idea of creativity, right? Or just like the embodiment of creativity, the doing of it, which is like, for me and my family, an inheritance of mine, right? And like an inherited understanding that like supersedes and outweighs the impact or like abilities of capitalism, right? I guess when I think about like what the value of creativity is to spirit and also like to body and to community, that's like a thing that feels like an ancestral gift. It kind of feels like a reach back, but even more so than that, it feels like a radical truth, like a truth telling. And then there's like this, and just to kind of like stay a thing that Esteban mentioned earlier. I really feel like in a lot of ways, the commitment to capitalism or like the protection of capitalism is like it's not a universal understanding. It's hella layered. Can I say hella? I can say hella, right? Like it's like I'm gonna say some other stuff. It's hella layered. It also like the levels of commitment vary so much based on like power and proximity to it, right? So I just wanted to add and mention how what it like just or even just like kind of encourage or like invite y'all to like think about what poor folks do with music. You know what I'm saying? And what oppressed folks have done with art historically, and what the value of that has been to like society and to the world, and I guess the polar of that is what rich and like wealthy and powerful violent folks have done historically with art and music, and like and what that and what that contribution has been to the cultural fabric of society and the universe. So yeah, so that's what comes up for me when I think about reaching back and like and embodying indigenous understandings as we think about and not think about as we fight for like a liberated existence and like dismantle oppressive economic systems. So
Yes. And Nia, I know on Friday when we talked, you mentioned the concept of excavation, which it sounds like you all think about and ground yourselves in at the Ujima Project. I'd love to hear more about it. Either of you, Sierra or Nia.
I think I can go first. Yeah, no. So I would just wanted to first thank Paul for that beautiful word. Yeah, and so, you know, Nia talks about excavation a lot. We talk about excavation a lot in our work and just in our general conversations. I think one, like, I'd like to say that there's a rich history of alternative and like subversive organizing and institution building practices in our communities that has existed for a very long time. Slavery couldn't foreclose it. Like, there are a lot of things that we went through that could not foreclose the possibility of us creating alternative practice. And so like when I'm thinking about that, just like very specifically, I'm thinking about like Black philanthropists that, as Esteban mentioned, like created mutual aid practices or mutual aid societies to like make sure that people had insurance, right? Like even back then that you need to have insurance, like to make sure that people had insurance or that they could pay their bills. Similarly, you know, there were businesses that gave out credit lines to working class people that lived in their neighborhoods because they knew that they were good for it. Like Black-owned businesses that gave out credit lines. And then there are like ideas of like the Susu, or like, I guess Roscas is the academic term for it, which are all like, they operate as like self-determined financial agencies for people that happen to be members of that Rosca. And so I think that when I think about Ujima, I'm just thinking about it being an iteration of those practices, those earlier principles and practices, and solidarity economy in general has a few of these, perhaps not like just like Ujima, but like Ujima is not unique in the fact that we are iterating on this. Like this has existed for a really long time. And I think that that was a little bit of the excavation that you were talking about, but I think that I also forgot the question. So
you got it.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I think just generally, you know, there are Maroon societies. I'm just trying to think of like all the things. I'm like, there are Maroon societies that give us like this rich history of self-determination as well. And so I think in general, I'm given the sense that we can do things differently. Like Margaret, you kind of talked about like, you know, forgetting that. I think that, you know, with Ujima and like, I think just being in the communities that I'm part of, like I'm constantly, even when I fail to remember those things, other people will remind me and vice versa, which is really helpful. And like, that's why we have conversations like the ones that we're having today, because sometimes you just need a little bit of, you need just that little booster. But yeah, I don't know. I think that just speaking to, I guess the first question too, like if our societies are constantly organized around the if infrastructure is always created to support that, then I hope, or like my wish for solidarity economy and for Ujima broadly, is that, you know, we can build infrastructures that like listen to people and honor their desire through true democracy and build infrastructures of care very generally.
Ooh, I want to get back to this infrastructure question, but can I say something about, I love this framing of excavation as a framework and a strategy for what it is that we're doing and a way of understanding what it is that we're doing, especially for ancestral and indigenous practices. So I just want to snatch a little piece of that. Part of my, I didn't say this in the intro, part of my background is in anthropology as well. And so I think about excavation not only from that sort of archaeological and like feminist archaeology framework, but increasingly I've been reading more about indigenous resistance and recentering, not in this, I'm on my own journey, right? So I'm not trying to say this in any way that's like passing judgment, because I feel like I'm late. I feel like we're all late to really grappling with what are we talking about in the harm of settler colonialism, and what is it that we have lost, and what are we trying to rebuild, and what hasn't been lost that there's still an opportunity to take those seeds and re-sow them. And so I've been reading The Red Deal that maps some of that out. And I want to recommend it to folks who maybe haven't read it yet. It's on Common Notions Press, which is run out of a worker co-op, a couple co-op spaces in New York and in Philadelphia. And it's so beautifully, it's, collectively authored and makes the connection between the broader societal it's just like, oh, we're fucked. Climate change, capitalism, genocide, incarcerate, like all the things, reproductive, like it's just like, hey, and let's bring you back over to, remember when we were saying how we need to be sustainable and thinking long term and doing repair work, that like carbon is this planetary enveloping pollution, but there's a way of shifting our set of social practices and not just isolating it to this idea that carbon is a particle, but that it actually has everything to do, climate change has everything to do with our social and economic relationships. So when I think about excavation now, I'm thinking about all of the work that, and not just indigenous people on in North America and Turtle Island, but, remembering that like Black people are indigenous, like all the ways in which it's like, let's reclaim our indigeneity. Let's start there. Mm-hmm. Certainly that has to do with reaching back into recent history, the last couple hundred years, and what recent ancestors, where there literally still is living memory of them. And then the ones who we have lost memory, but there is still practices. When you eat corn, remembering like, this was not found in nature as some abundant thing that you can, and versatile, you can make popcorn and all these things. This was cultivated to be this. So what are all of the different kinds of practices that are rooted in solidarity and cooperation that go back literally for millions of years, that are fundamentally human, and that are woven into nature, that for all of our history until recently, until 500 years ago with capitalism, we were very interdependent with all the ecosystems around us. So that when we talk about excavation, I'm like, those are the ways, because it's not just because of a spirit of nostalgia, but actually there is no other way forward, right? We're bouncing back from the Thatcherism of there is no alternative. It's like, well, actually, not only are there many economic alternatives to what Reagan and Thatcher were up to, and what all of the leaders in the UK and the US have been perpetuating since then, but actually we have no other. This is how they frame it in the Red Deal. It's returning to indigeneity, or it's extermination, right? We have to like decolonize, or we're all gonna die out. We're all screwed.
Thank you, Esteban. I love the idea of reclaiming our indigeneity, and I've been thinking a lot about that as a Korean woman, and thinking about like the very recent, to your point, the very recent sort of ancestors who, the line that's been there for thousands of years, and sort of the experience being here, and sort of the disconnection that I felt, and sort of reclaiming that feeling, even if I'm still in the United States, and what that can do for my power is something that I've been thinking a lot about. So I love that. And I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about some possibilities, if we all like, some possibilities around building this in small ways in our communities, starting with sort of entrepreneurship and small businesses. I know, Esteban, you do work with worker co-ops, including that in this framing as a potential site of practice around these visions and values. So I work to support entrepreneurs here. I think it's an important avenue for growing agency and power, but it's a really fraught practice, right? It's really harmed our communities in a lot of ways. That's certainly not the sort of answer to systemic oppression as we sort of conceive of it now. And I just wanted to hear from you all, maybe starting with Paul, what about sort of the way that entrepreneurship is in our current system doesn't sit well with you? And what is your ideal vision for entrepreneurship instead?
Yeah, a lot of what I think and like feel about entrepreneurship is hyper local. So like I live in the place. I'm a 7th generation New Havener, right? 7 generations, yes, seven generations. So my great grandmother's great grandfather came here in the 1820s, right? So when I think about the idea of entrepreneurship, like I'm literally just thinking about my neighborhoods. So like that's my disclaimer, right? it's tough for me to imagine like realities that resemble solidarity without like hyper local like wealth redistribution here, right? So I like when I think about thriving economies and when I think about thriving like entrepreneur communities here, like it's tough for me to imagine to like, not tough for me to imagine, like it's tough for me to like feel great about anything that doesn't involve like the redistribution of wealth and power here. I just want to say that that's a thing of mine specifically, right? And so like I don't know. So it's a tough question for me to really reflect on eloquently because there's a lot of frustration pent up in there. The other piece I want to add is something that Luis sort of alluded to or mentioned earlier. It's just like the massive amounts of wealth and power that exist like in these blocks and in this like tight city. The kind of wealth that like could heal, if not instantaneously, very very close to it. The kind of wealth that could just transform the realities of generations to come. While also like not completely dismantling like these systems that the rich white folks here are beholden to be honest. So I just wanted to like just kind of throw that out there as my response, and I just feel really passionately about the foundation of that being that like this is a thing, this is an experience of mine, and it's a thing that I'm navigating now as a person who runs a business, right, or who's founded a thing, right, but I've struggled to disrupt that's the system in ways that don't harm our people, right? So redistribution and a commitment to redistribution is a vehicle that I feel like I've like tapped into, and I believe in the potential of, especially in a generational sense. So
yeah, thank you for that, Paul. And it makes me think a lot about the work happening at the Ujima Project, and sort of the ways in which you all are trying to see from the outside, trying to see how enterprise can be bent towards justice and liberation and not be at odds with one another. Is that possible? And I'd love to just hear about your work in sort of that space and navigating that tension and what you've learned. Either of you.
Sure. I think I think I am still thinking about the prior conversation and how it connects to this question, because I think entrepreneurship is also a deep part of our history that I would want us to take care to acknowledge. So when we talk about the different ways of being and practices that we can harken back to, I think entrepreneurship is a part of that. So I think some of the work of Ujima and the other thing that I'm thinking about, particularly with the excavation piece too, is for who. So I appreciate, Luis, you brought up the opening, the land acknowledgement, and then there was the second piece that was a solidarity statement that talked about decentering white communities. So a lot of Ujima's work is not about white people at all in any way, shape, or form. Our audience is not white people. We're a multiracial, multi-class organization. We have white members, we have white supporters, we have white investors. White people are not our audience. And that I definitely firmly believe the excavation that we do is with our audience. Again, and Esteban talked about this. I'm hearing some kind of robot voice. I don't know if y'all are hearing that, but again, to reclaim our full histories, that have been buried. And for me, entrepreneurship is a part of that history. So I think that's one bit of work with Ujima. I mean, the other piece, and Esteban talked about this as well, is in thinking about ways of being and thinking about different practices that we can hearken to. I think there's important work that we do in valuing that. And again, we're valuing it for each other. We're not, Esteban also earlier talked about, obviously Esteban and I talk a lot on different panels and then and otherwise, but also kind of talked about like this resistance work, right? And defending rights, et cetera. Definitely, and I just have to make the decision to talk about Black people. Oftentimes when I'm talking, we're also just defending our very humanity often. And so I think the work of Ujima is that our humanity requires no defense. We don't need to prove our humanity to anyone. There is not any power that can make any judgment of our humanity in any way, shape, or form. And so then when we are bringing in mutual aid into our work, when we are bringing in gift economy to our work, and some of the ways that this shows up with our businesses, for example, is really thinking about, for example, how we partner with them to not be extractive in our investments. And so when we're thinking about what the terms of our investments are and what that relationship looks like, for me, it is valuing us, and it is saying we are of true value. And so I think the connection to that then with regards to entrepreneurship then is likewise as a business owner, how are you valuing your fellow community members? And so Paul, you talked about this, I think, with just this kind of struggle to be redistributive and be in a certain relationship with communities. And so we're here to say, along with all of our peers, a lesson has been that the purpose is profit, right? That the primary purpose is maximum profit. That's why you are here, entrepreneur. That's why your business is here. And we're moving and saying that isn't the primary purpose. By a stretch. Of course, we've got to generate revenue, we've got to sustain, but that is not the primary purpose for starting a business and running a business. The purpose for starting a business and running a business, and this goes back to, and I think we've been in a few conversations where we just talk about what economy is in the first place, which is it's how we care for ourselves and it's how we resource ourselves. And so entrepreneurship should be able to connect directly to how that business is caring for community and how that business is resourcing community.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, Sarah, were you going to jump in on that?
I think that you should go first.
I'll do the Ujima sandwich. I'll jump right in. I was just going to say, I think we need new theories of power. You know, I've been saying this in movement spaces for the last couple of years, but I think when we have a different sense of power, one that does not come from the nonprofit industrial complex and this idea that if we just finally have access to the right rooms or halls of power and cross our fingers and maybe some bipartisan coalition will like sign an executive order that's in our interest or some nonsense. Like that's not how change is going to happen. Like the change that matters, right? And so part of why I do this work, part of why I think those of us here on this panel do this work is because we have an understanding that part of the gaps in the power on the left, and especially for Black and Indigenous communities and other communities of color, is a lack of economic power. Why? Because all of the power in the hands of the ruling class, which is almost entirely white, has come from us, like that their power was extracting from us, from our labor, our land, our wealth, our culture, whatever. They can monetize that immediately, and so it's not enough to win whatever it is, the culture wars. Okay, now we're declaring Juneteenth as a holiday. Now, Chase Bank is sponsoring Pride, like all of these things, and it's all rhetorical. Nobody is actually saying, never mind what we post on Instagram. Our corporation is divesting from this, and we're directly putting it into this infrastructure that is going to build the mechanisms for generating and retaining wealth within communities of color. Nobody's out there saying that. They'll be all like, "Oh yeah, let's hear more Black stories or Black voices," right? But where is the Black say? Where is the say? Where's the infrastructure for us to be able to do that? That's what this work is about, right? So when we talk about a new theory of power, it's recognizing that we have this whole world, this whole apparatus that is built around recognizing corporate power. And so it's one thing to say, here's our critique of corporations. We've been doing that. I've been doing that since the 90s, and it's been going on way longer than that, right? But what does it look like for the left to organize our own institutions that can tap into that existing infrastructure? There are tax laws and breaks, things that are built around making things easy for corporations. Why are we one of the very few not tax deductible nonprofits, but we're a 501c6 nonprofit in the US, which is basically a chamber of commerce, right? Like it's us, and it's like the Dairy Farmers of America, and it's the NRA. Why aren't there more movement organizations that are organizing themselves in this way to be able to exploit, or at least plug into all the different benefits that exist there, right? So there are so many different ways that we need to think about. That's obviously a lot of why I do a lot of this work, building out cooperative economies. And mostly for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been focusing on worker ownership and centering worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces in that work, because I'm really curious what it will look like for us to not only build labor power, which obviously we're in deep solidarity with not only formal unions, but also alt labor, worker centers, restaurant workers, people who are organizing in different kinds of formations, but also to build our own workplaces, to be able to then mobilize within our own capital pools, our own assets, to be able to leverage those things to get access to some of the different programs that exist. These are all things that can be plugged into movements. I'm not saying that liberation is going to come from us building up our own chamber of small businesses, whether they're Black owned or communally owned or whatever, but it is an ingredient in this recipe of how we see change happening, right? And if we're not building any of that, we're just ceding so much territory on the battleground around our economic livelihoods and future. And the last piece I'll say about this is that I think that it also gives us an opportunity, not just selfishly for our own communities and whatnot, but to demonstrate that there is a way that we can create jobs where there's harassment-free workplaces, where there's pay equity, where there's a way to do business, to be profitable or to be in the black, and to do so while repairing, not just being carbon neutral or whatever, but actually repairing the land, the soil, the air, repatriating, reparations for indigenous people, like that. There's a way. So by building up businesses of our own, we're able to disrupt the story that we get from all of the profit maximizing corporations that say, well, this is the only way we could possibly have a thriving economy.
Absolutely. Sierra, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard for me to enter into this conversation or like this idea of entrepreneurship because I don't think about Ujima, and I honestly have very limited experience outside of Ujima in the solidarity economy, because Ujima was actually my first introduction to the idea of the solidarity economy. And so I don't actually think about entrepreneurship on its own. I actually think about futurity. And so when I'm thinking about that, I'm just thinking about Ujima and this idea of like planning and architecture and infrastructure and like business and all those other things. And they go beyond like our material built our material environment. It's like how we structure our relationships with other people, with like the land, with other beings, as you know, Esteban just so brilliantly put it. And so I don't know, I'm just thinking about how we acknowledge and recognize spaces that can't be seen through the traditional lens, that are produced by Black people and people of color in the name of liberation. And obviously there's like this common pathology that, you know, there's just uneven development. Like it's just a fact of life, right? And so for me, Ujima and like, I guess solidarity economy broadly is the counter project to that. Nia talked about our standards for financing, but we actually have standards for our businesses that they have to adhere to in order to receive investment. So you actually have to pay your workers a living wage. You actually have to have a plan to go green. You actually have to have women that work there. You actually have to be 50% POC owned. Like there has to be some sense of ownership and kinship with the people that are in your neighborhood. And you actually have to have a good relationship with the neighborhood. Like obviously there are a ton more, there are 36 as I stated, but I just wanted to like cite that as like, you know, Ujima, when I talk about building infrastructures of care, like this is what I'm talking about.
Yes. Thank you, Sierra. And I wanted to give Luis a chance to tell us a little bit about the Semilla Collective, because I think, you know, this conversation, we started off talking about sort of entrepreneurship and businesses, but we're also talking about power, self-determination, self-governance, and I think the story of Semilla and sort of the economic work that you do could be really enlightening to hear about, and specifically what the vision for you all and sort of how you think about power and self-governance in the work that you do at Semilla.
Sure, thank you. So in the beginning of the pandemic, my partner and I got a bunch of food donated when one of the some of the Yale colleges, residential colleges were being shut down. So we got tons of food, and my partner works for an organization that works with childcare providers, and she had this chat with 15 providers, and they had their own networks. And she sent a message to them and said, "Hey, like we have a bunch of food, can you come and pick it up?" And they came and the food was gone in a couple of hours. The next day we got more food, and the next day we got more food. And then we realized that, you know, we shouldn't have people in the middle of the pandemic come into our place. We should call our friends and then have these boxes delivered to those who were who needed them the most. Knowing that our undocumented folks did not have any stimulus checks coming to their bank accounts, did not have any unemployment benefits and all that stuff. So with that, we relied on the ecosystem that we have in New Haven, where we have tons of really good friends and connections, and we're like, you know, where can we get boxes? Where can we get refrigeration? Where can we get more drivers? And then we sort of like started this like very lively system where we figured out by ourselves, without the intervention of the municipal government, without the intervention of the federal government, of the state government. And we realized that the answers to create something new, to imagine something new, is within ourselves. That the communities where we live in and the resilient folks that are working through the pandemic, that the answers are here with us, and that if we're able to organize folks in that way, we can create something. So now we're 16 months or however long after the pandemic, and we are creating a tortilleria co-op. You know, and we worked with Collab to work with this, and 3 of the box recipients are leaders in this cooperative, where like at some point they received the box because they heard about these boxes, and now they are coming to meetings, they're facilitating, they're creating this cooperative. At the same time, the Semilla Collective is also working politically. You know, like how do we change politically? How do we push for laws that allow that bring healthcare to undocumented folks? How do we create a space for youth? So I know that we're running a little bit out of time, but I think like the answer is within us, and the idea of collectivism, of how we can that we don't know much, but together we know a lot. And when we organize and when we imagine something new, we can create something new. So we're thinking about, the cooperative economy. How do we create jobs? How do we create a hub for builders? How do we create a space for people to really to thrive? I'm thinking about migrants migrants who are farmers, for instance, and there's many of them who live in our communities who have a lot of knowledge about farming, yet there's not really a space for immigrant farmers to create that. So the question is, like, how do we plant the seed, and how do we set up these garden beds for these seeds to grow?
Thank you. And, I think the Semilla Collective and the Tortilleria Semilla is a great example of how sort of the spirit of entrepreneurship, the good parts, if you will, can really be used to create something that works for our communities. And we sort of along that line, we have a question from the public chat that I'd love, Esteban, if you're up for it, to answer, which is, entrepreneurs are a romanticized class within the story of capitalism, in part because it makes heroes of individuals. Can entrepreneurship be rescued even as we move past capitalism?
Right. I mean, I think that entrepreneurism, the ism, there's a lot that's laudable and worth celebrating about it, right? That I see that as it's a dimension of leadership, of strategy, of insight, like being able to see that there's a thing, or just organizing, like you're bringing skills around being able to like make a thing happen. Beautiful. We need that. The problem is the individualism piece. It's not entrepreneurism itself. It's that it's stripped of interdependence and solidarity. So if we sort of recenter the embeddedness in a social context of taking some of those entrepreneurial skills, every cooperative needs it, right? Especially if it's a new idea or an existing enterprise or organization or community organizing effort, mutual aid effort, like Luis was just describing, we always need somebody who's thinking like, oh, is there a better way to do this? Or is there another angle toward whatever kind of initiative we've got going on? So if we can find ways to decenter that individualism aspect, and I think that this gets into the culture piece as well that Paul was talking about earlier, to share stories of collectivity, of groups of people doing, what would it look like instead of lifting up MLK if we were able to dig into all of the women of color who were organizing for decades leading up to all of the wins in the 1960s? That goes back to the 1920s and 30s. And we should be able to know more than the names of 5 or 10 of the leaders from that movement. But to recognize that there was so much leadership embedded in it, that's kind of how I think about entrepreneurism, that if it is embedded into a collective project, and there still are ways of celebrating the gifts and talents of individuals within that, but not individualism, right?
Well, yes. And I really appreciate that, Esteban, because that would be what I would say is my problem with entrepreneurship is there's a myth of individualism. And I think it's important to call out the myth.
Right.
Because entrepreneurship mostly is not an individual endeavor. So, and
yeah,
again,
it's who's investing in your thing?
Right. And so this kind of also again points back to that cultural work, which is differentiating between what the myths are and what the actual reality is. And so even MLK didn't do anything on his own. And so recognizing that even the, when we kind of look at this notion of a singular charismatic leader, that is a fabrication. And so there should be some criticality with which we are consuming these myths and these stories. It shouldn't make sense to any of us that a person did something all by themselves in most situations. That should ring as absurd and ridiculous. And then I think if we kind of start to dispel some of these myths and reject the myths, I think then we can start to contend with what the actual realities are and work our way from there. We're moving amongst a lot of delusion right now, actually.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both for answering that question from the audience. And I think it's a good segue to sort of my closing question, more of a prompt, which is that I'd love to just like hear from anyone who wants to just what the future could look like. Just to end on sort of what might be possible. We have a small local group that Paul is a part of that we get together every month to talk about some of this stuff. And one of the activities we once did was kind of just like sitting in our senses and feeling in our bodies what it might look like if to have a flourishing solidarity economy, both in terms of economics, right, but also emotional health, art, culture, love, community, care. So I'd love to hear at least a couple of you share what comes to mind before we close.
I mean, I would love to talk about the road to liberation and and how do we get there. And I think I mentioned like the political part of it. I think like if we think broadly about the federal government, I think that we should create the space for us to be the folks who are representing us in government. And I think that hear me out on this. I think that like when we think about like our governor here in Connecticut, for instance, he's a multimillionaire person from Greenwich. So he inhabits that domain. So he pushes for legislation or pushes against legislation that doesn't fit his friends and his the world in which he inhabits. So I think the road for us to get there, I think I believe it's political, where we democratize all levels of government. Starting from our city council to our mayor's office, to our local senators and representatives, and we just turn it upside down in the sense that like we need representative democracy. We need people that look like us at those positions of power, because otherwise we're not going to break that rigid wall that these very rich white people have built around themselves to protect their wealth and to protect their power.
Thank you, Luis. Any other closing thoughts on that question from other folks?
I think so. I'm just trying to reflect on what I feel like I see happening right now, and how and so then with the possibility is, I guess, for some permanence from what's happening now. And so I'm thinking of how we move, and so I'm just kind of thinking of our sense of selves. I think one of the just kind of most celebratory things to me about this moments, I guess depending on what time frames we're talking about, is I think it does kind of go back to some notion of power, just in terms of who's determining what. And I feel like I have seen individual and collective taking, for lack of a better word, of power. So I just think of kind of rejection of certain. I mean, this entire conversation, rejection of certain narratives, embrace of other narratives, creation of other narratives. I think a lot, like Esteban is thinking about what type of ground we're ceding in certain aspects, and so I feel like I've seen us take some ground, and yeah, I think a future there's a future where, just for lack of a better phrase, we are just in better possession of ourselves. and we are less, at the whims of others. That's one of the things I think about.
So speaking of culture, you know the meme about like something in the streets and this other thing in the sheets. I think that there's a version of that can answer this question for me, which is that, and I'm just scooping up things that y'all have been saying throughout this conversation. I think it's an expansion of democracy. Obviously, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what does everyday democracy, economic democracy, yada, yada mean? We were talking about input versus voice versus vote versus say versus economic, right? So democracy. So I think it's kind of democracy in the streets and transformative justice in the sheets, because there is something that's a little more intimate, personal, private, that like it's you, it's your neighbor, it's the person down the street, it's the person who you were in a band with and then they kicked you out of the band. There's things that actually are not about the bigger infrastructural things. That's more about how do we all roll? What is the culture of that liberated future? So I think that that's what transformative justice begins to answer. And of course, the conversations that we have in TJ organizing are that like, we don't have a here is the model, like here's the thing that you do, but it is an approach and a framework that it pushes us toward re-examining every aspect about how we relate to each other, what our assumptions are, how harm happens, what is the context that enables harm to happen, and what do we then do, so that everyone is considered in how we repair and heal. So that to me is sort of the balance. It's like the democracy and TJ. And I don't know if it's streets or sheets, but there has to be some reckoning with the ecological element to all of this.
Word. I was actually going to say something very similar. I think it's like building a collective muscle around how we are in relationship with each other that's a little bit better. I don't know if it'll, or in the very far future, or like the very near future, depending on how strong your love muscle is, like it's us being in better relationship with each other, and I think, when we talk about democracy at Ujima, like specifically in Nia and I's conversations, I'm also thinking about like how we disagree and like principled struggle, and like that not being like, super blow up in your face and like everybody's mad, but maybe us having a better relationship to disagreement as well. And making new choices, or making better choices in how we disagree.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about just like I feel like I'm excited to continue having these conversations and building and framing and exploring new narratives and like building that like muscle memory around like what it looks like for us as a people to like divest from like violent capitalist systems, right? And what it really means to do so in sync, right, and in step, and also what it and reimagine like what we do with our like creative property and our souls, like where we channel that energy and what that energy becomes, and also the realization for me anyway. I feel like I'm excited about the realization universally that these systems don't. This society doesn't exist without us, and the collective desire, the collective decision to abandon it is the dismantling of it, and that makes my whole heart smile, and I can't wait to see y'all on the other side of it.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you to all of you, Sierra, Dia, Paul, Luis, Esteban, for the amazing conversation we just had. Each of you are doing such incredible work. And I think importantly, you're doing that with the collective just at the front and center. And I feel so honored to have been a part of this conversation with you all, and a part of the movement. So thank you so much.
Woo! Thank you all so much. Wow. My name is Elizabeth. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the curator of ideas programs at the festival. It has been a joy, an honor, a delight to bask in the collective wisdom of this group. Thank you. The power of imagination is changing our world already, and it's really wonderful to get to be in space with y'all. So I have a couple closing announcements. One is that for folks who are listening, we want to hear more from you. Like, let us know what's up, what you're feeling, what your story is. We have a survey that lets us know how we're doing. You can comment, you can fill out the survey. It's at artidea.org/survey. We want to know whatever you want to tell us. We are back on the New Haven Green this weekend. So we have live music as well as ideas talks online, food events, all kinds of things. Check out the calendar. It's artidea.org/calendar. And coming up just this weekend, oh, my dog says hello. Coming up just this weekend, we have, we're doing some world building with an amazing astrophysicist called Moya McTeer. She does phenomenal work imagining real and science fiction futures for us all. I hope we get to see lots of you back. All of this information is at artidea.org. So thank you. And I can't wait to see you all soon. Have a great night.
Picture me growing freely, no ceiling, no roof. Going deep with no stones to entangle my roots like they do.
Waking up tired and waiting for the horizon to appear. Remind me this work is all for love again. Looking ahead, I see home.